There's a lot of debate as to what mirrorless camera effectively killed the professional DSLR, but I'm gonna give it to the Sony A9. Hello everyone, my name's Josh from Videos by Josh, and today's a special day. As of recording, it's November 6th, 2023, and it is said that Sony is going to make a big announcement tomorrow regarding their A9 line of cameras. Nobody knows for sure, but if it is, I thought it would be helpful to put up a video explaining where exactly the A9 came from, the history of this camera line from Sony. So let's get into it. As of time of recording, there are two cameras in the A9 lineup, the A9 Mark I and the A9 Mark II. The A9, sometimes called the Alpha 9, is a full-frame mirrorless interchangeable lens camera from Sony, and it is their flagship model. Flagship being the best and most high-performing camera that they make. Well, at least when they were released. I'll get into that. The A9 Mark I released back in April of 2017, and it was a very disruptive camera. The A9 was the first true professional camera from Sony in its Alpha series of full-frame cameras. It was competing with the likes of the Nikon D5 and the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II, which were incredible workhorses in the professional space. And you gotta remember, at the time, in 2017, mirrorless cameras weren't as popular as they are today. So the A9 Mark I broke a lot of incredible new ground for mirrorless cameras and for Sony as a brand. Part of why the A9 Mark I was so popular was because it was incredibly fast and took incredibly good photos. The camera introduced the now quality synonymous 24.2 megapixel X-Armor RS stack sensor. It had a very high, for the time, ISO range of 100 to 51,200 with a range that could be boosted even past that. Its electronic shutter was blistering fast at 1/32,000th of a second. This was also the same camera that introduced Sony's industry-leading autofocus with 693 phase and 425 contrast detection points. If you remember back to 2017, Sony was hands down the leader in autofocus, barring a bit of debate with Canon. Their autofocus, their dual pixel, was also quite good, but Sony just lapped the rest of the competition. The A9, being positioned for sports and wildlife photographers and other high-performance careers, made this camera incredibly fast. You could shoot 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter and 5 frames per second with the mechanical. The camera itself did 60 autofocus calculations per second with real-time eye tracking for humans and animals. And the screen and viewfinder were also incredibly high quality, with the EVF coming in at almost 400 million dots. Prior to the A9's arrival in 2017, the professional photography space was ultimately dominated by large, bulky, weather-sealed cameras, primarily DSLRs from the likes of Canon and Nikon. Photographers had gotten used to shooting on these bigger pieces of professional equipment, which meant that many new adopters of the Sony system felt that this camera coming out was relatively delicate or required a certain amount of finesse. It was physically smaller, even with the battery grip, and the mirrorless technology made it for a compact form factor with a lot of computational hardware inside, meaning that Sony really had to deliver on a reputation of reliability with these cameras in order for them to take hold. And the design language between the Sony cameras and the other professional cameras in the space was also very different. As you can see, the A9 was the first amongst these professional caliber cameras to have a flippy screen, which we now take for granted. And the fact that you could remove the battery grip was likely a positive for some people. The A9 Mark I also introduced the NP-FZ100 battery from Sony. This is a camera battery that we still use today in our modern Alpha and Cine line cameras. It's an incredible battery. Here's an example of how dominant the autofocus was in the Sony camera. The Sony A9 Mark I had 693 autofocus points. The autofocus system in the Canon EOS 1DX Mark II had 61. That should show you how big of a gap Sony was creating with this camera in some feature sets. We also got that iconic gold A9 logo on the top left of the camera, which I think is one of the coolest looking camera logos I've ever seen. So to wrap it up on the A9 Mark I, Sony released this camera at a time where mirrorless cameras were a really interesting subject for the general population. You could see them gaining popularity with innovations in the A7 line and lower level cameras, but there had yet to be a competitor for Sony in the top end of photography, and that's what the A9 Mark I did. It put Sony on the map for a lot of photographers looking for cutting-edge features in a professional body with options that the other large brands couldn't give them. Now, many early adopters did have to risk jumping ship from established brands in the space like Canon and Nikon to go with this camera, so it was a big decision for these photographers, especially if you've invested your career or a number of years of your life collecting glass for those systems. If you had a bunch of expensive Nikon or Canon lenses, your incentive was to stay with that system. But the one ace up Sony's sleeve, a benefit to being in the mirrorless system, was that you could actually adapt Canon and Nikon lenses to the Sony system if you had to. And it didn't work the other way around. E-mount lenses, Sony lenses could not go onto those other cameras. And while it's naive to assume that professional, top-level photographers would ever shoot on adapted glass, especially at the time, it was an option for photographers looking to continuously leverage some of their more exotic lenses that they personally liked or wanted to use, where they didn't have to use the most cutting-edge technology like the autofocus and integrations, because adapters at the time weren't as good as they are today. So overall, Sony had an incredible value proposition with the A9 for professional photographers, and it is because of this reason that the A9 series got off on such a good footing. The Sony A9 II was announced in October of 2019 and was a pretty hyped up successor to the A9. The A9 Mark I was a trailblazer in many regards for the mirrorless space, and it was looked at as indeed the flagship for Sony in the mirrorless space. So the A9 II had a lot of expectations to live up to. This new camera carried forward a lot of the successful technology that made the A9 I great, while also implementing some subtle improvements. Both cameras had the same megapixel sensor. They both had incredibly fast electronic shutter, mechanical shutter, autofocus, and they even had the same EFV and LCD screens. The first thing you'd notice with the A9 II is that it was a little bigger. The camera had bulked up, not nearly as big as some of the DSLRs of the past, but it had gained size. A welcome addition was actually a deepening of the hand grip on the A9 II, making it easier to hold. Weather sealing, while not a big complaint on the A9 I, had been improved on the A9 II, which resulted in a much more solid feeling camera. Sony pushed the drive speed of the A9 II way up. The A9 II doubled the performance of mechanical shutter in the A9 Mark I, going up from 5 FPS to 10. Sony also stated that the A9 II was tested up to 500,000 shutter cycles, which, if you're familiar with modern professional cameras, they usually get tested up to 200,000 cycles, so this was a big deal. The A9 II also introduced an anti-flicker mode that helped adjust the exposure of the camera to meet fluorescent lights or weird lighting in your shooting conditions. The autofocus was still blazingly fast, even more so, and you got an additional half a stop of in-body image stabilization. There was also a bunch of creature comforts for professional photographers. They added a LAN port for fast file transfer, and this is a feature that nobody ever talks about, but on the A9 II they added voice memo. You could literally talk to your camera and it would record your voice notes if you needed to document your notes on what pictures you were taking. The example that Sony uses for this feature is that if you're like taking pictures of an award ceremony and you want to just say who's getting the award into the camera to document it, that would be a good use case, and I could totally see it. There were other incremental upgrades which the A9 Mark II presented, but overall the mantra of this new camera was essentially set. The A9 II wasn't the giant leap and bound in technology that the A9 was at the time, but it was a serviceable upgrade to an already incredible camera. Truth be told, on the original A9, it wasn't the inside of the camera that needed so much work, it was the outside, and Sony addressed that with improvements in connectivity and the physical shape of the camera. They made some improvements where they could, but largely it was an if it ain't broke, don't fix it type of scenario with the A9 II. And photographers, despite being a bit disappointed with the lack of extreme innovation from Sony, did flock to this camera to use it professionally. That is, those with the money. I didn't mention cost yet, and I think it goes without saying that the A9 series of cameras, the flagship professional cameras from Sony, are amongst the most expensive they sell. The original A9 came out in 2017 with a retail price of $3,500 USD, and the A9 Mark II launched with a price of $4,500 USD. Once you tag on a battery grip, some extra SD cards, cards, connectivity cables, extra batteries, a charger, and whatever other accessories you need to do your specific type of photography, not even including lenses, and you're looking at a considerable investment that could possibly break 5 figures. And that's also why the A9 series is so hard to find out in the wild. You see them at professional events, but often you don't see them at your local photo meetups. In the wake of the A9, much later down the line, Canon released the R3 with its own blistering set of performance specs. Like, just to touch on one aspect here, so the A9 II had 693 autofocus points. The Canon R3 has 4,779 autofocus points, and at this point, it just feels like we're saying numbers. And even Nikon too, releasing their Z7 and to follow their Z9 high-performance mirrorless camera. The running for best mirrorless camera is now as close as it's ever been. And barring any new announcements, potentially tomorrow, it kind of looks like Sony's losing this fight. Well, I say they'd be losing if it wasn't also for the A1. This video is not about the A1, but I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about it. The Sony A1 was released in March of 2021 and essentially represents everything that the brand could pack in a camera. Traditionally, the A9 cameras were photography focused with lackluster video specs, but the A1 sought to crush everything together in an ultimate performance camera. With an MSRP of $6,500 USD and incredible video and photography specs, the Sony A1 took the flagship title away from the outgoing A9 Mark II. And at the time of recording, it looks like that is the case. But I am excited to see what Sony's going to announce, and you should be too. Because, as I've said before, it's never been a better time to be into camera equipment, photography, or anything in the creative space. We have so many new opportunities with the technology that we interact with, so many new tools to make exactly what we want to. It has never been a better time to be a creative. So that's the legacy of the Sony A9 series. It was an incredibly innovative line upon its introduction and continued to be an incredible workhorse for professional photographers across the globe and continues to be relevant to this day. And despite being in many ways surpassed by cameras outside of Sony's lineup and even in the Sony brand, the A9 continues to be a legendary camera series within the technology of mirrorless cameras. What do you think about the series of Sony A9 cameras? Have you ever shot with one of these elusive cameras? I've only got my hands on them once or twice. Such a tough camera to find out there, even in rental shops. What do you think about Sony's A1 camera, and how does that relate to the A9 series? Let me know what you think, or if you shoot on any other camera brands, let me know what you think. As always, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate you very much. If you do leave a comment with a question, I will try my best to answer it. I read every single comment, and I want to thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.